Are you struggling to stretch your budget for student ministry or wondering how to fund that next big event? In this episode of Student Ministry Connection, I'm going to share some practical tips to overcoming budget challenges and offer some advice on establishing, managing, and requesting a budget, along with some strategies of effective fundraising. Welcome to part one of a two-part series on student ministry finance. Welcome to Student Ministry Connection, a podcast for those who serve in student ministry but also want to grow as disciples and leaders. My name is Steve Cullum, and in addition to being a youth pastor myself, I'm also a missionary with National Network of Youth Ministries. And in all of my 20 plus years of student ministry, I've had the privilege of being mentored and going to classes and learned a lot about budgeting, especially in my early years. And I'm very, very thankful for all that. But when I started out, I was clueless. I mean, sometimes churches give you money and expect you to budget, and sometimes they give you nothing and expect you to run this ministry. And in those early days, I was so confused at how I actually do that. But I'm so thankful for the mentors and the Bible college professors and others who have come alongside me and helped me over the years. But I know for many of you, that's not the case, and you haven't had that same kind of support. Or even if you have had that same kind of support, we can all continue to grow in different areas of our ministry. And in fact, over the last couple of years, I've seen countless other youth pastors ask questions about budgeting and finances and how to make their dollars go even further. So I thought I'd do just a two-part back-to-back podcast series on budgeting. Today, we're going to talk about the actual budgeting process. And then in the next episode, we're going to talk all about ways to save money and do ministry on a shoestring budget. So today we're talking again all about budget. And this goes for people that don't even have a budget. Maybe you're wondering, how do I even have money or get money for my ministry? And if I don't have a budget, how does that all work? We're going to talk about all those things in just a moment. But before we do that, let's pause to thank the sponsor of this episode. Ministry can be complicated to navigate, especially when you're juggling multiple jobs, roles, or youth ministry gatherings. Student Ministry Connection believes that the best leaders are healthy leaders, leaders who are able to lead from a place of abundance rather than exhaustion. And that's why we believe in G-Shades Youth Ministry Curriculum. With the release of Season 6, G-Shades is your simple solution for a gospel-centered youth ministry. Season 6 includes a year's worth of volunteer training resources, parent training resources, outreach events, discipleship events, and even 2 camps. Their curriculum is laser-focused on helping students see themselves, God, and others through the lens of the gospel, and it shows up in every topic, series, and week. And you can amplify your reach with G-Shade's engaging video messages, whether it's sharing the videos with your digital audience, giving parents a full preview of the content beforehand, or sending them out the next day to catch students up who missed out. G-Shades allows you to extend your ministry's reach, and that's not to mention the benefits of your students hearing the gospel preached from different voices and perspectives. There are lots of great youth ministry curriculums out there, but G-Shades sets itself apart because of a strong focus on the gospel. I've been so impressed with Mike and his team as they've created an amazing gospel-centered curriculum. So head over to gshades.org to catch your first glimpse of G-Shades with a 4-week free trial. And when it's time to buy, you can use the offer code CONNECTION for 10% off their top-tier curriculum. G-Shades, seeing life through the lens of the gospel. You can find the link to G-Shades in our podcast show notes. All right, let's talk budgeting. So in the very beginning, I want to just acknowledge that some of you may not even have a budget. And if that's the case, we're going to talk about that in just a moment. But before we jump into all of that, I think it's important that we establish what a budget is. So a budget is simply the money that you expect to spend on this next year of ministry. And every church or ministry has a budget of some sort. Some of you have a student ministry portion of that overall budget, and some of you do not. But Every church and ministry has a budget because money is incoming into the church, usually by giving or tithes and offerings from the church members themselves. And that money goes to pay for bills and salaries and the ministry of the church. I remember when I was younger in church and I kept thinking that the money that we gave in offerings just somehow actually went directly to God. I didn't process that fully as a young child, but as I got older, all of a sudden it started making sense that money was actually used by the church leaders to carry out the ministry and do things that's needed for the actual church. And so, yeah, like we're not sending that money into heaven somehow. God has entrusted that to us to use it properly. And so that's where our budgets come from. But I know some of you are sitting there or walking there or whatever you do when you're listening to podcasts, and you're thinking, Steve, this all sounds great, but I don't have a budget. I've been asked to run this student ministry, but they've not given me any sort of money at all. I'm just expected to make this happen somehow. And so, number one, I just want to say I understand a little bit of that because that was one of my ministries that I was in early on, and I had to walk in those shoes as well. But I will say that things can change. So, number one, if you're in that situation, you can ask for a budget. You can go and talk to your leadership and give a really good pitch about why you want a budget for your ministry. And you can compare it to other ministries and do this all in a loving way, saying, hey, like I want to accomplish this and this in this ministry. This is what God has put on my heart. And I feel like I really need to lead the ministry in this way, but I need some support financially. And I encourage you to do that. But in the meantime, there's other ways to make things happen. And one of those is fundraising. I've had to fundraise not only for my current ministry that I'm doing right now with National Network of Youth Ministries, but it was also something I've had to do in previous ministries. And even if I had a budget that the church gave me, there was still times where I had to fundraise for things that were above and beyond. A lot of those things are mission trips and camps. And the truth is that they're not getting any cheaper. In fact, the costs are going up and up and up. And I'm not telling you anything you don't know already. And in fact, that might be the reason why you're listening to this episode, because you're wondering, how do I pay for camp when it just keeps going up and up and up? Well, my first encouragement to you is that I don't think it's right for churches to pay for all of a student's camp registrations or mission trips or anything like that. In fact, when I talk budgeting, I think it's important to put a portion of the camp or mission trip in your budget, like let's say transportation or the cost of adult leaders to go, or scholarships for those families who need financial assistance. But I wouldn't put the entire cost of a camp in your budget and expect the church to pay for all of it. I think it's important to have families and students who pay their way toward camp. But again, I know that's really, really expensive. And so there's other ways to go about getting that money. And one of those is fundraising. I've done a lot of different fundraising over the years. Some of those would be selling candy bars or selling different things within the church and your community. And from my experience, I don't really get much back from those in terms of finances. It's great to do, and if you want to do it, you can, but I'm usually not a big fan of those. There's also church-wide events that you can do or community events. And this is where I tend to push people is to do these kind of event-based fundraising. So if you're going on a mission trip, for instance, you could do a dinner that's themed maybe to the area you're going to. So one time we did a mission trip to Puerto Rico, and another time we did a mission trip to the Dominican Republic. And in both of those instances, we did dinners that were focused on that type of food from that area. We talked about the trip and all these different things. We decorated our room like the areas we were going to, and just made it a big event that people could buy tickets for, invite their friends to, and we raised a lot of money in one night. I've also done silent auctions and other types of events, and that's what I usually recommend for people to do as an event-based fundraiser. You're going to raise a lot of money in a really short amount of time, and you're not going to have to worry about selling those candy bars week after week after week and make not much money in return. I also recommend doing personal fundraising. So for students that are going on mission trips, especially, I highly recommend them sending out letters and talking to their friends and family. There's also other ways of raising money in similar ways. For instance, there is the envelope thing where you put 1 through 100 on envelopes and put it in your hallway or on a wall in the church, and people sponsor $1 for the 1 or $2 for the 2 and so forth. There's a bunch of different ways to creatively fundraise, but I highly encourage students to do some of that fundraising themselves rather than that all being on you as the youth pastor. And then when it comes to camps and mission trips, have a conversation with your supervisor and your finance team, your leadership of your church, to ask, is it okay if people sponsor students to go on this camp or this trip? A lot of times they'll be okay with that, and you can even set up a special fund or something like that to make those scholarships happen. If you don't have a budget where you put scholarships in there already, maybe asking people directly to sponsor a student to go to camp might be your way to get those funds started. And then finally, there's always options of grants and seeking external support from your community and a lot of other ways to raise money as well. But I'm not going to get into that today. This is more of a 101 kind of fundraising talk. But if you step into a new ministry and you have a budget, you need to start by assessing what budget you have and where your ministry actually stands financially when you step in. Typically, you won't be stepping in at the very beginning of a fiscal year. And what that means is, if you're not sure what a fiscal year is, basically just the calendar year of a budgeting process. So some churches or ministries run from January to December, the actual calendar year, and that's your financial year. Great, that's simple and easy, but most of them don't. I've been in some churches that started in June. I've been in some churches that started in September. I've been in some churches that started other months. Figure out whatever it is, but the chances of you stepping in at the beginning of that fiscal year are slim to none. So most likely you have an existing budget that you need to assess as you carry out that fiscal year. So talk to your financial person, whoever is in charge of the finances at the church. Ask if you can get a current stance of where your budget is. So not only do you need to have a list of all your current expenses in that fiscal year, but you also need a copy of the budget that was decided upon at the beginning of that fiscal year. And you're going to compare what was planned to spend versus what you have actually spent or what the ministry actually spent at that point. And this is going to be a constant thing. So you're always wanting to be comparing what you actually planned to do versus what you are actually spending in the ministry. And this needs to be a regular thing all the time, comparing those expenses versus the expectations. You can track a lot of that stuff on your own, but I'd also recommend having regular conversations with your supervisor or your church's finance team or leadership or whoever is in charge of those finances to understand what's available that you can use. Remember, a budget is not exactly set in stone. It's all dependent on what's given. So you may say, I have a $20,000 budget for my ministry, but if the giving is down for the church, well, you don't have that $20,000 to spend. So even though it's budgeted, it doesn't always mean it's there. But when you finished out that fiscal year or you get close to the end of that fiscal year, you're going to have the opportunity to budget for the next year. And what I highly recommend is looking back at the entire last year of ministry, get that on paper, get that on a computer screen, whatever is best for you, and then also look ahead to the next year. You want to do your best to estimate how much you think you're going to spend in this next year of ministry. And so that's going to account for curriculum, trips, anything like that. Do your best to plan out the entire year of your expectations for expenses. And I also recommend putting those in a calendar of sort. Most finance teams are also going to ask you, or they'll find it very beneficial if you do this for them, to map out your expenses throughout the year. So if you know you're going to go to camp in July, for instance, you're not going to pay for all that in July. You're most likely going to pay that in April or March, or you're going to have an early deposit that you're going to have to put forth maybe back in January or December of the previous year. Whatever that is, make sure you map that out so you know not only how much you're going to spend, but when you're going to spend it throughout the year. And as you think through the next year's expenses, it's also important to think through what's the goal of each event. Who is this event for? What's this thing that we're going to do? And what's the maximum that we think we should spend on this? And that's what you're going to put in, the maximum number. Don't think about your minimum number. Think about the maximum number you think this could cost, because inflation's a real thing. Costs of different things go up. And so think about the maximum number you can spend. That's how you put together your entire budget. I think it's also important to prioritize your expenses as well. So as you're thinking through what you're going to spend money on in this next year of ministry, it's important to prioritize stuff by what is essential. What are those things that we have to do as a ministry, or those items that we really need to get? And what are those things that are nice to have? Maybe you prioritize camps, or you prioritize a specific curriculum that you really want to use. You prioritize going on a mission trip. But then maybe nice to have is that new soundboard, or that new TV, or that new whatever for your student room. Not only does this help as you think through your entire ministry year, but also this is going to help when that finance team comes back and says, hey, I'm going to need you to trim like 10% off of this budget, because that always happens. They rarely will take your number that you give them in the very beginning and say, okay, that looks great, and move forward. Almost always you're going to have to do some trimming. And if you've already thought through those essential versus nice to have kind of things, you know where you're going to trim. And as you do prioritize, I encourage you to keep the impact of your ministry front and center. What is the main thing? What's your main vision that you're going after? And let all your spending and all your planning come out of that. What has God set up for you and this ministry and this community? And again, let all your budgeting and planning and everything flow out of that. But as I said earlier, and you know already, camp and other things are not getting any cheaper. So how do we cut costs? Well, like I said, I'm going to talk a lot about that in the next episode on how to do ministry on a very inexpensive budget. But before we get into that episode, I think it's important to think through all of our different events and just ask the question, how can we save money on this trip? Some of that includes booking early. If a camp opens up early with an early bird price, sign up the day you can get that price. There's also group discounts. So if you get more students to sign up, sometimes you get a bigger discount. Or if you collaborate with other ministries and churches, there's ways to share the cost with others. And maybe you don't go to an existing camp, but you run your own. That's another way sometimes of saving some money. Or maybe you don't buy the biggest curriculum that's out there, but you buy one that is more affordable, that fits your needs, and then you can grow maybe into that bigger one. And talking of curriculum, we have our sponsor that I mentioned earlier, and you can use that code connection to save on G-Shades. And of course, there's always those DIY options. You can create your own supplies, you can think up your own activities, or even use your venue rather than going to another location. All these are ways to cut costs that are going to make your budget last longer. Again, like I said, we're going to talk more about this on the next episode, but I think that's enough for now. Let's move on to planning ahead. I mentioned this earlier in terms of your budgeting, but I think it's really important to think long-term in terms of your planning and your budgeting. Be proactive with your budget. Think ahead on all the different things that are going to happen within this next financial year. Think through all the camps, all the curriculum, all the other events, all the resources you're going to need to get for your ministry, the books that you're going to get for your team or you to continue growing. Also think about those gifts that you're going to get for your volunteer team to show your appreciation for them. Think through all of those different things that are going to happen in this next year. And also, just like your personal budget, set aside some money for bigger events and also for emergencies. Something is going to break or something's not going to go well one time. And when that happens, you're going to wonder, do I have the budget to make this happen or to fix this thing? So make sure you're thinking ahead and also planning for those emergencies the best you can. And this is probably the best place for me to mention that you as a youth leader need to have a really good relationship with your church's leadership and the financial team or financial person. That relationship is really, really important. So you can always ask those questions and have open conversations about all the budgeting things that you're thinking through and your needs. And when you have those conversations in the planning process, it's going to make those conversations so much better as you carry out that year of ministry and you have more questions about your finances and where you are in your budget. And that brings us to the end of this quick Budgeting 101 episode. I hope it's been beneficial to you, or maybe it's kind of sparked some more questions. And if you have questions, please be sure to reach out to me. You can reach me on most social medias at Steve Cullum, or you can reach the podcast as well. All those links are going to be in the show notes. And you can also reach out by email to studentministryconnection@gmail.com. I would love to know if any of this has sparked more questions for you, and I could dive into more of that in a one-on-one kind of conversation. And if this has helped, I would encourage you to also share this with other student ministry leaders that you know. And while you're at it, be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast app and leave us a positive review. And if you'd like to support my ministry with National Network of Youth Ministries, you can do that at the links in the show notes by signing up for my financial team or my prayer team or both. All of your support helps me to carry on things like podcast, retreats, networks, and so many other ways that we're able to support youth leaders like yourself. And before we wrap up, I also want to thank G-Shades for sponsoring this episode. Please head over to gshades.org to check out the latest season of the G-Shades curriculum and also use the promo code CONNECTION to save 10% off your order. Well, as I said earlier, the next episode is going to focus solely on ways to save money in your ministry. So be sure to subscribe so you don't miss it. But until next time, be sure to stay connected, and may God bless your ministry.